I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And welcome to the second part of this really exciting event that we want to thank the Academy of American Poets for organizing. We were originally actually going to be showing one of my most favorite films, Contempt, which I think epitomizes a certain element of Anne Carson's work, to the new wave imagery and the classical imagery. And unfortunately, we're not able to show the movie, but I understand there'll be a 4-minute segment from the movie being shown during the course of the lecture. Before we begin, I want to also thank Alex Dimitrov, Christina Laprise, and Billy Merrill, who have been instrumental in making this happen. Now, for those of you who've just come up, there is seating on floor 2 here, so you can go down and simulcast, and it's a cozy place to be, let me tell you. So and you can come up afterwards and talk to Anne Carson. So before we continue, I want to just make a couple of announcements. Tomorrow we have a roundtable called The Imagination of Hamlet, and it's being hosted by Paul Fry from Yale, and Robert Brustein, the distinguished theater scholar, will be here, along with a number of others, including Christian Camargo, the actor, Laura Levine from NYU, Eugene Mahon, the psychoanalyst, and Susan Wolford, the Shakespeare scholar. Now, on November 6th, we have Finding Equilibrium in Hitchcock's Vertigo, another of my favorite films of all time, and we are showing the film that day. So come for the roundtable and for the film showing. Other events include From Muse to Music, Exploring the Craft of the American Art Song with Stephanie Chase on the 14th of November, and then a very exciting panel on December 5th called The Art of the Graphic Novel. And on that panel, we have Linda Barry, Hilary Shute, Christopher Couch, Ben Kachor, and Francoise Mouly. So without further ado, I want to introduce Christina. Where are you? Christina Laprise. Thanks so much.
Sorry. Thank you, Francis, and thanks to Adam and Edward Nersessian at the Philoctetes Center. My name is Christina Laprise, and I'm the Publicity and Events Coordinator for the Academy of American Poets. And on behalf of our staff, I want to thank everyone for coming out and joining us this afternoon. And I'd also like to extend a special thanks to the members of the Academy of American Poets who are here tonight, or this afternoon, rather. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to do events like the Poets Forum, so thank you so much. Also, much gratitude to the New York Department of Cultural Affairs and the Department of Humanities as well. Their support is invaluable to all of our programming. If you're interested, after the reading, you can purchase books from Mobile Libre, so that you know. And I think there's also going to be a brief signing as well. But without further delay, I am honored to present Anne Carson, a Homeric kind of event in and of itself. Anne Carson is an award-winning and internationally acclaimed artist, classicist, composer, and author of numerous works, including Knox, which was recently released by New Directions, and her work resists, or rather transcends, the confines of traditional classification, a feat that allows the reader and viewer to access to an uncharted yet seemingly familiar landscape. One feels perhaps an invitation to serve as co-creators and maybe even co-conspirators in the invention of a moment and the reinvention of a past. And it's within these moments that one senses the intense intimacy and startling objectivity of Carson's work. Her boundless imagination and intellect challenge convention while also delighting, confounding, and inspiring audiences around the world. And I have no doubt that we'll find anything less in her talk today. Please join me in welcoming Anne Carson.
Hi, thank you for coming. This is kind of weird. It's like giving a lecture in a living room. And I apologize to people I'm got my back to, and also people who will get a stiff neck. So you don't have to look at me. A public announcement. I think, as was mentioned, we're going to show a little bit of a movie, which I'll be talking about now and then. at the end. So after I finish talking, there'll be just, I think it's about a 4-minute clip of Bridget Bardot naked, which is a reason to sit through all the paragraphs in between now and then. So I was in Berlin a while ago, and I went to an art opening of a very famous, very celebrated, very wealthy American artist. And we were all there, like milling around, looking at the art, drinking wine, chatting. And a man came in from the street, made his way through the crowd, stood in front of the artist and engaged him in conversation for a few moments, and then hauled off and socked him in the nose, yelling, "You sellout!" So I began to get interested in this concept of the sellout. What does it mean to be a sellout nowadays? Because most of us sell pretty much anything pretty much all the time. What's the difference between mere selling and selling out? Seems to be a very thin border, and yet one that we're intuitively aware of all the time. So anyway, I was pondering these things, and more pertinently, since I'm a classicist and I like to trace everything back to Homer, I was wondering if the ancient Greeks had this concept of the sellout and this concern for the very thin border. So I did some research, and sure enough, Homer turns out to be the very first artist in our tradition, the Western tradition, to build a work of art around the question, what is a sellout, and to perch his hero on that very thin border. The work, of course, would be the Odyssey and the hero Odysseus, who, I'm going to argue, is a person who comes very close to selling out and then at the last moment transcends himself and his own materialism and is saved by the power of true love. But let's go back to the distinction between selling and selling out. Selling is quite common, selling out allegedly more rare. We cherish this distinction, we worry about it. Certainly Homer cherished and worried about it too, although in slightly different terms and with a slightly different tonality. I would like in this lecture to try to map our distinction between selling and selling out onto the economic values of Odysseus' world, and then to explore it further in two 20th century works based on Odysseus and his adventures, namely Alberto Moravia's novel Il Disprezzo, published in 1954, and Jean-Luc Godard's Le Mépris, a movie based on Moravia's novel and filmed in 1963, both of which works come over into English as Contempt. Homer himself was in all likelihood a poet who sang for his supper, that is, a professional bard. And although it's hard to say anything definitive about Homer because scholars can't even agree on whether or not he existed, they do believe that we can see what his life would have been like from characters in his poems who are themselves professional entertainers. In particular, the character named Phemius, who appears in the Odyssey as a poet attached to Odysseus' own household. Phemius' name means simply teller or storyteller, and his function is to make up stories, poems, songs to entertain the company at dinner each evening, in return for which he receives food, drink, lodging, and honor. Here is a passage from the first book of the Odyssey, where Odysseus' son Telemachus is instructing Phemius the bard on how to please his audience. You know, the song most honored and praised among men is the one that sounds new and fresh to the ears of its listeners. I'm pretty sure Homer also felt this pressure to come up with an epic poem that would sound new and fresh to an audience who had loved his previous bestseller, the Iliad. The Iliad was a hard act to follow, a war story unlike any other. So Homer made the Odyssey a post-war epic. It idealizes survival rather than death and features Odysseus, a hero for whom survival is pointless unless profitable. Odysseus is a hero of acquisition. He could have made it home from the Trojan War in a month and a half, but he travels the world for 10 years, soliciting guest gifts and hospitality from everyone he meets. There's a strange scene in Odyssey, Book 19, where Odysseus himself explains this behavior to his own wife. At this point in the story, he has finally arrived home to Ithaca and is talking to his wife Penelope, but doesn't want her to know who he is yet, so he has disguised himself as a traveling salesman from Crete. He tells her he recently ran into her husband, Odysseus, on his journey, and he adds, "In fact, your Odysseus would have been home long before now, but it seemed to his mind more profitable to go to many lands acquiring stuff. For Odysseus knows profit over and above mortal men, nor could anyone else alive rival him at this." Penelope does not question this explanation. She knows her husband as well as he knows profit, and she knows the economic system in which he is a player. Odysseus is a land-owning, wife-owning, slave-owning aristocrat within a highly controlled aristocratic economy of mutual reciprocity and gift exchange. This is a society of noblemen who pass their wealth around to one another in the form of hospitality, feasting, favors, and gifts in order to reify their own noble status. They are at pains to make a distinction between their own wealth, which is honorable, and traders' gain or commercial profit, which is not. Aristocrats give and receive gifts. They do not buy and sell merchandise. The distinction is both physical and metaphysical. Gifts are not measured, calculated, or priced. Profit is not the point. To use Marx's terms, an item of merchandise is an alienable object exchanged between two mutually independent transactors. Their relationship is impersonal, and it stops with the transfer of goods. A gift, on the other hand, is an inalienable object exchanged between two transactors who recognize a reciprocal dependence. You give a gift to an ally, a kinsman, a friend. To put yourself in debt is the point. Gift and merchandise represent two different notions of value embodied in two different sets of social relations. The sets ought to be mutually exclusive. In fact, historically and psychologically, they share a very thin border and sometimes overlap. Although the profound conservatism of a gift economy is inclined to defend that border fiercely. In Homer's diction, then, aristocratic wealth, the stuff of gift exchange, takes the form of treasure, or the Greek word is kaimelion, which is a noun derived from the verb kaimai that means simply to be situated, to lie there and do nothing. The noun kaimelion is defined as something to be laid away or treasured up. In other words, something that its owner does not need to use for his own survival. Kaimelion in epic poetry usually takes the form of bronze, iron, gold, silver, fine cloth, or sometimes women. These objects of treasure have some direct use and give aesthetic pleasure, but their real importance is as symbolic wealth or prestige wealth. They have definite economic value, and yet they are, in some absolute sense, beyond price. In theory, then, Odysseus does not wander the world for 10 years racking up stuff out of motives of avarice or greed. He brings precious things home in order to store them as treasure or give them away as gifts. Nonetheless, as any astute reader of the Odyssey will observe, Odysseus's own economic practice differs somewhat from this theory. It's true he inhabits an economic order where the parameters are set and the rules are clear, yet he does like to test that very thin border. More than any other hero of ancient epic, Odysseus seems to enjoy gaming the gift exchange system for all it's worth, and sometimes takes a lenient attitude toward that pesky distinction between honorable and dishonorable profit. There is a certain irony in his tendency, whenever he's in a tight spot and needs a fake identity, to pass himself off as a commercial salesman. No such irony distinguishes the hero of Moravia's novel Il Disprezzo, which I'll quote from below in the English translation of Angus Davidson, or Godard's movie version of it, Le Mépris. Both contempts tell the story of a writer who is 100% humorless. His name is Ricardo. He's hired by a big American movie producer to come up with a script for a film of Homer's Odyssey. Ricardo is educated, narcissistic, and neurotic about money. He's taken the screenwriting job because he needs to pay off an apartment he bought for his wife. But he feels the job is utterly beneath him. He refers to screenwriting as merely a stopgap, refers to his existence as tainted and crippled by money, refers to screenwriting as a kind of rape of the intelligence, and says of his script, "Now I shall have to submit the Odyssey to the usual massacre, reduce it to film." While he's working on this massacre, his marriage falls apart. At the end of the story, Ricardo's wife speeds off with the American producer in his sports car and is killed in a freak accident. Both the novel and the movie end tragically. Homer's Odyssey notably does not. What saves Odysseus from tragedy is, on the one hand, his economic attitude, this combination of gamesmanship and irony that Homer sums up by saying Odysseus is one who knows profit, and on the other hand, the fact that he genuinely likes his wife. In fact, I think this may be two sides of one coin. But let's consider wives. Ricardo's wife in Moravia's novel is Emilia, a happy former typist, not her husband's equal in education, intellect, or moral sensibility, as he frequently reminds us. He is the narrator of the novel. Instead of conversation, Ricardo bestows on her long paragraphs of the self-analysis of Ricardo, which she receives with a blank stare or simply leaves the room. The plot of the novel revolves around the mysterious contempt that Emilia begins to exhibit toward Ricardo shortly after he accepts the screenwriting job. She acts cold, decides they should sleep in separate rooms, and after 9 chapters of his ceaseless interrogation, admits she doesn't love him anymore, that she in fact despises him. He analyzes this for the rest of the book, eventually deciding that he offended her the first time they went out to dinner with the producer by allowing the producer to drive her to the restaurant in his sports car while he, Ricardo, followed in a taxi. That is, Emilia presumed her husband was pimping her to the producer as part of the scriptwriting deal, as if Odysseus had come home and told the suitors to do what they liked with Penelope. It remains unclear to me whether we are meant to believe this explanation of Emilia's contempt or not. It is only one of a number of hypotheses that Ricardo advances, and Emilia placidly agrees with each of them in turn. Her motives, her real desires, her psychic depths remain opaque to the reader right through the end of the novel. In Ricardo's view, she is a person entirely unconcerned with self-knowledge. Of the accident that ends her life, Ricardo says, she died without knowing it. This inscrutable person is played by Brigitte Bardot in Godard's movie, a casting choice that changed certain quotients of the story and the production. Bardot turned out to be what Proust calls his character Odette, a trouble halo, not only because she was blonde, while the Emilia of the novel is dark, but because she cost 5 million francs, was followed everywhere by paparazzi and a phalanx of bodyguards, and represented for the France of that time a consummate definition of the female, Brigitte Bardot bent the story out of shape while ensuring its success at the box office. Godard needed a box office success. His last two films had failed, and no one could say where the French New Wave was headed. He didn't like to see it headed for Hollywood and Hollywood's production values, but when he took on Brigitte Bardot, he took on all the complexities and compromises of a big-budget film. He had to change his methods and surrender authority to an American producer named Joe Levine. In many respects, his situation was oddly analogous to that of poor conflicted Ricardo in Moravia's novel. Oscar Wilde would admire the way art stepped forward to become life in this scenario. But wasn't it also Wilde who said, "The only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it"? Godard yielded so thoroughly to the temptation of CinemaScope, he created a movie that is a spectacle of compromise. Soaring past the ethical quibbles of the novel, Le Mépris, the movie, celebrates its own selling out in a spirit of self-delighted cunning that would make Odysseus proud. Godard is a man who knows profit. He is an artist who can make out of the theme of profit an epic imaginary. And when he installs Brigitte Bardot at the center of his movie, she takes it to another economic level altogether. But let's return for a moment to Odysseus and the question of singing for one's supper. By far, the best suppers Odysseus gets in the Odyssey are on the island of Calypso in Book 5. Calypso is a minor goddess who falls in love with Odysseus and detains him for a number of years against his will. He's fascinated for the first week, then bored, and gradually subsides into a kind of despair that I would call economic, because Homer frames it in issues of supply and demand. Calypso's island is magical. It supplies every possible demand Odysseus might have for food, drink, clothing, sex, companionship, or conversation. He has only to pay over the coin of his self, his entire self. Calypso wants Odysseus' body and soul. She wants everything about him, physical, moral, and verbal. She wants the work of art that he has made of his own human being. And she wants it for all time. She promises to immortalize him. When he rejects the transaction, she's baffled. Why would anyone choose to abandon a consumer paradise where he could live forever with a ravishing divinity? Odysseus' answer is, "I know you're a goddess and bigger and better looking than my wife, for you are deathless and ageless, while she is a mere mortal, and yet I prefer Penelope. And what I really long for is the day of my return." Odysseus' answer sets up a calculus. He measures the infinite days and infinite pleasures of Calypso against the single day of his homecoming and the mortal attractions of his wife. The infinite comes up lacking. Neither Odysseus nor Homer ever tells us exactly what the infinite lacks. That is, we never get an objective description of Penelope. We do not know if she is dark or fair. Odysseus nowhere itemizes the qualities that make her more desirable than a goddess. What becomes clear in the final stages of the poem, however, as husband and wife engage in a so-called recognition scene that extends from Book 17, where Odysseus shows up in disguise at Penelope's house, to Book 23, where she falls weeping into his arms and calls his name, is that these two people are a match for each other in wits and ambiguity. We watch her, throughout these 6 books, seduce him by the simple tactic of never letting him know what she's thinking. She dangles herself, she dangles the prospect of homecoming before him in a series of tantalizing interactions. She gives him clothing, a meal, a bath, a bed in the courtyard, and several deep conversations, without ever letting on whether she's recognized him or not. Scholars still disagree on where exactly in the poem she decides that Odysseus is Odysseus and she should welcome him home. Penelope's power is the power of a meaning withheld. So too Emilia, the wife in Moravia's novel, seems to her husband Ricardo a moving locus of ambiguity. He cannot grasp her. Since she is just a typist, he attributes this to her being badly educated or corrupt or, as he puts it, unconscious of her own inner life. We never find out if this is true. Emilia's character is always out of focus, seen through the lens of Ricardo's exasperation. There are times she is so ungraspable she falls apart before his eyes. This is a description he gives of how her face changes when they are arguing. She looked at me, and I noticed then a peculiarity which I already knew. Her beautiful, dark, serene face, so harmonious, so symmetrical, so compact, underwent through the irresolution that cleft her mind a process almost, as it were, of decay. One cheek seemed to have grown thinner, but not the other. Her mouth was no longer exactly in the middle of her face. Her eyes, bewildered and dim, seemed to be disintegrating within their sockets, as though within a circle of dark wax. When I first read this passage, it struck me as horrifying and Ricardo as a pretty weird guy. But on second thought, it occurred to me he and his attitude would have been perfectly at home in Homeric Greece. Greece was not only a patriarchal, but a gynophobic culture, woman-fearing, whose nightmares chiefly featured examples of the female as a content without form. There is ample ancient evidence from medical, philosophical, and legal writings, as well as from literature, that woman was regarded as a creature whose boundaries are unstable, whose power to control them inadequate. Deformation attends her. She swells, she shrinks, she leaks, she perforates, she disintegrates. Think of the female life cycle with its bloods, its penetrations, its pregnancies, its changes of shape. Think of the monsters of Greek myth who are mostly women with deranged boundaries like Scylla, Medusa, the Sirens, the Harpies, the Amazons, the Sphinx. Self-control is a virtue, physical, mental, and moral, which in the view of the ancients women categorically do not possess. In order to achieve form or consistency, the female must submit itself to the regulation and articulation of the male. So it comes as no surprise that even death does not end Emilia's incoherence. Moravia's novel has a very strange denouement, in which, directly after the traffic accident that ends her life, the wife appears to the husband as a ghost and conducts a long conversation with him, then evaporates. Afterwards, he cannot decide if this really happened. He says, "So in death, as in life, there was no true conformity, and I should never know whether she was a ghost or a hallucination or a dream or perhaps some other illusion. The ambiguity which had poisoned our relationship in life continued even after her death." Unlike Odysseus, who falls in love with his wife a second time because she is so perfectly unknowable, and who arguably abandons a goddess because he finds in Penelope's mortality the ultimate aphrodisiac, Ricardo resents and begrudges Emilia both her death and her formlessness. But in the last paragraph of the novel, he lights on a plausible course of action for them both. He will write down her story. He will write, in fact, this very novel. He will capture the trouble halo of Emilia within the measures of his prose. She is not, after all, uncontainable. He can contain her in sentences. She is not, after all, beyond price. He makes her part of his own transaction with poetic immortality. He sells her out. When Jean-Luc Godard undertook to repeat this transaction and capture this ghostly woman in the movie of Contempt, he found it difficult. He explains in a 1963 interview why he failed to transform Brigitte Bardot into the Emilia of Moravia's novel. Bardot, he says, is a block. You have to take it as a block, all in one piece. That's why it's interesting. Interesting is key. I've read Moravia's novel 4 times, and I can't manage to find Emilia interesting. Perhaps it's part of Moravia's intention that Ricardo's rendering of his wife should flatten her like a coin run over by traffic. Whereas in the movie, when the Bardot block takes over this character, its ambiguity is amplified so as to develop a depth, an individuality, a flesh it doesn't ever achieve in the book. She is no Emilia, but she has one important thing in common with Odysseus's wife. Like Penelope, Brigitte Bardot is a secret. She remains a secret. I can't analyze this. I'll give an example of how it works in the movie, of how she and Godard collaborate to make it work, to keep her secret. There was a critical issue of profit involved. Oscar Wilde again. Morality, like art, means drawing a line somewhere. When he shot the film, Godard had drawn a line at Bardot's body. He did not exploit it. There is a bathtub scene, but it shows her lying in the bath with a very large book of film criticism obscuring her private parts. When the American producer Joe Levine saw the first cut of Contempt, he flew into a rage. He felt he'd been cheated. He demanded nudity. He was determined to get his 5 million francs worth out of that body. So Godard added a scene at the start of the film, before the credits. It shows a naked Bardot lying on a bed with a man beside her. They're talking. She's asking him if he likes her body. She itemizes every body part. Do you like my toes? Do you like my knees? Do you like my ass? She asks. Which do you like better, my right toes or my left toes? My right knee or my left? My breasts or my nipples? Meanwhile, the camera roves around her body, dwelling most lengthily on her backside. The man answers each of her questions solemnly, and at last says, I love you totally, tenderly, tragically. To which Bardot, with majestic ambiguity, replies, Moi aussi, and the scene ends. Bardot performs this scene entirely without contempt. Her gestures are simple, transparent, her tone of voice quietly banal, her attitude as innocent as water. And somehow, from the pure center of this total and totally imposed exposure of herself, she disappears. Even as she puts herself on sale, toe by toe and nipple by nipple, to masculine judgment, to Godard's camera, to the moviegoer's gaze, she eludes the transaction. She becomes something exorbitant, as a secret must be, as a gift must be. We could never afford her. And from this moment on, she is the soft master of every scene. By far my favorite of her tactics of soft mastery is the wrap gesture. There are, I think, 3 places in the movie where Bardot puts on a bathrobe. In each case, as a single action, she shrugs it on, flings the belt around her waist, draws it tight with both hands, and leaves the scene. It's stupendous. She wraps herself and goes. She wins. Every time she does this, she wins the movie. Are you an innately unbounded thing? The movie asks her, and instead of answering, she wraps herself in boundlessness and exits. Brigitte Bardot is the hero of this epic. She finally is the one who knows profit. From the opening shot, she comports herself as a chameleon, as a treasure laid up, and she seems able to retain and to impose on us a sense of this chameleon as exorbitant, as a gift beyond price, as a knowledge beyond knowledge. Like Odysseus, she has the power to possess it or give it away. And in collaboration with Godard, she manages to make us believe that profit, for those who know it, can have a transcendent face, or at least a transcendent ass. Thank you.